Russia. One quick glance at the map tells you this is an impregnable fortress, except instead of walls, it has distances. Vast, merciless distances. Anyone who tried a large-scale land invasion eventually discovered the same thing. This damn country simply does not end. But this duh moment usually happens too late. Supply lines are already overstretched, the army is worn down, and all that lay ahead is more Russia. Napoleon was the first to learn this lesson. France stretches about 1,000 kilometers, around 620 miles, from west to east. The distance from the Niemen River, the border at the time, to Moscow is almost 1,300 kilometers, roughly 800 miles. And that, to be clear, still isn't all of Russia. Good luck to you, little man, fighting that giant. Hitler had it even worse. Germany is roughly 650 kilometers across, about 400 miles, while the distance from Ukraine to Moscow is about twice that. Invading that thing makes no logistical sense whatsoever, which is why, in every major war, Russia's strategy followed the same script. Even if things went badly at first, retreat, regroup, and then steamroll the enemy. This approach never failed. Russia looked invincible, if not for one small but. Geographically speaking, Russia has always had one serious problem. And no, we don't mean the occasional bear encounter. We mean two very specific regions. On the map, they look like minor blemishes. In reality, they pose a strategic threat to Russia's very existence. For centuries, Russian rulers were obsessed with controlling these points. Time and again, Russia reached for them, and each time failed. This obsession wasn't paranoia. These are real choke points, and by applying pressure to them, one could literally choke Russia to death. NATO knows this perfectly well, and this is exactly what Russia still fears today. The only question is, if put to the test, will it work? On the How the World Works channel, we like to zoom out and take in the big picture. Which is why, naturally, our conversation about 21st century geopolitics must begin with the Trojan War. At the end of the first millennium BCE, near the strait linking the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, stood the prosperous city of Troy. One of the foundations of that prosperity was trade, already dense and very international. Copper flowed from Cyprus to Asia in huge quantities, cast into ingots shaped like ox hides. We know this for a fact. Ingots exactly like these have been hauled up from the seabed at the site of an ancient shipwreck. Tin, essential for making bronze, was shipped from places that sound improbably distant, that is, Cornwall in Britain. Crete supplied elegant, finely crafted vases. Asia Minor sent construction timber, and lapis lazuli arrived from what is now Afghanistan. This was a humming exchange network, and Troy was very much plugged into it. And yet, control of the straits was not especially critical at the time. The reason is simple. The Black Sea region had very little to offer the Bronze Age world. But in the first millennium BCE, in the age of iron and classical Greece, that would change completely. By then, the straits had acquired the names we still use today, the Bosporus and the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles were named after the legendary king Dardanus. The Bosporus, meaning ox crossing, comes from the myth in which Zeus, disguised as a bull, carried the beautiful Europa from Asia to the Balkans, crossing the sea at this narrow point. It's a lovely story, if by lovely you mean kidnappy, that is. But for Greeks of the 5th century BCE, the straits evoked not a myth, but a hard, cynical, and deeply unsettling reality. When war broke out between Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian War, a kind of Bronze Age prototype of the Cold War between the USSR and the United States, one thing became clear almost immediately. Wealthy Athens, with all its money and ships, had a glaring weak spot. Athens was a textbook maritime power, technologically advanced, outward-looking, invested in crafts and trade. And as such, Athens depended critically on imported grain, and its fleet depended just as critically on shipbuilding timber and hemp. Both came from the Black Sea region, what is now Crimea and Ukraine, which is why Athens fought to the bitter end for control over the cities along the straits. This was the pressure point that the Spartan commander Lysander, the real architect of Athens' defeat, chose to exploit. In 405 BCE, a Spartan fleet built with Persian money crushed the Athenians at Aegospotami, a river not far from the Dardanelles. Once Athens lost access to grain and shipbuilding materials, it was game over for them. This was the first clear case in history when losing control of the straits meant losing everything. Fast forward 1,000 years. It's now the Middle Ages, and the world has grown noticeably larger. By this point, 3 major trading systems are up and running. The first was the northern one, linking the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea through a dense web of rivers. This route was used mainly by the Vikings, traveling through Slavic lands, but rarely asking for permission. In medieval Russia, these Vikings were known as Varangians. Setting out from Sweden and Denmark, they carried amber, valuable furs, and wax. Along the way, whenever the opportunity presented itself, they would replenish their stocks with living merchandise, so highly prized in the chattel markets of Constantinople, without the slightest pangs of conscience.
Do you mean like they sold slaves and stuff?
Yeah, that's exactly what we mean. Also, if you ever wondered why the Latin sclavus and the English slave derived from it sound suspiciously close to slave, well, that's why. Running in parallel was the Arab trading system. Arab merchants shipped pepper, cloves, pearls, and precious stones from India. From Arabia came rare resins and incense, myrrh and frankincense. Part by ship, part by caravan, these goods made their way to Alexandria in Egypt, and from there continued onward by sea. Finally, there was a third circuit, the European one. Merchants from Italy supplied woolen textiles, jewelry, and works of art. All 3 of these worlds converged at a single nodal point, Byzantium, with its capital in Constantinople, modern Istanbul. It was one of the richest and most prosperous cities of its age, and it just so happened to sit right on the Bosporus Strait. Quite a coincidence, huh? In fact, of course, it was no coincidence. Byzantium literally stitched together opposite corners of the inhabited world. Hordes of Arab coins have been found in modern Scandinavia, and medieval European art is full of motifs, like the famous image of 3 hares running in a circle that wandered in from China via the Great Silk Road. None of this would have worked if Byzantium had not firmly controlled the straits while charging a handsome fee for the privilege. One problem with such setup: if you're sitting on a deep well, someone is eventually going to want to wet his beak in it. That someone turned out to be Venice. The Venetians lacked the military muscle for a head-on collision with Byzantium, but they more than made up for it with money and cunning. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, the Crusader army was supposed to be heading for Egypt. Instead, thanks to a masterclass in bribery and intrigue, Venice redirected that army toward Constantinople itself. The Venetian fleet was personally led by the Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo. And that man was a legend, an old-school, tough-as-nails guy. After all, a man was over 90 years old and almost completely blind when heading for a major war. Yeah, they don't make people like that anymore. And so Constantinople fell. Its treasures were looted. On the ruins of Byzantine Empire in the Balkans and Asia Minor, the so-called Latin states of the Crusaders sprang up. But the real winners were Venice, and a little later, its commercial rival, Genoa. The Venetians secured free passage through the straits and full access to Black Sea markets. Those markets, incidentally, now looked very different. The old northern trade route had withered away. No one was hauling wax and furs from Scandinavia anymore. Their place was taken by a new, brutally profitable commodity: slaves. Human cargo flowed from the Black Sea lands inhabited by Slavs, as well as from the eastern Black Sea coast, from the Caucasus. The latter were especially prized by the Muslim rulers of Egypt for their exceptional military qualities. Fighters from Dagestan dominate modern MMA. Back then, they formed the elite guard of the Egyptian sultans, the fearsome Mamluks. So, yes, masterpieces by Venetian geniuses like Giorgione or Titian were, at least in part, paid for with money earned from the slave trade. You might find this morally disturbing, but on this channel, we study how the world actually works, not how it ought to. Which brings us to 2 more historical coincidences. First, shortly after the Italians gained control over the straits in the 13th century, the Renaissance took off in Italy. Second, shortly after they lost control over the straits in the 15th century, the Renaissance came to an end. In its place, another power began to rise: Turkey. In 1453, the armies of the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople. From that moment on, the Turks controlled the main bottleneck of world trade. They fortified the Black Sea coast, and in Crimea, a vassal Crimean Hanat emerged under their protection. Trade, however, did not stop. Turkish merchants and Christian merchants cooperated whenever it was profitable. Business as usual. The difference was where the money ended up. Now the financial flows accumulated in Istanbul. The baton of prosperity has literally passed from Byzantine hands to those of the Ottoman sultans. And this transition can still be seen with striking clarity if you stand in the central square of modern Istanbul. On one side rises Hagia Sophia, the symbol of Byzantine wealth. Directly opposite stands the Blue Mosque, built in the 17th century, the symbol of Ottoman prosperity. And the Blue Mosque is larger, mind you. Also, in 1683, Turkish troops were besieging Vienna. And here's yet another little-known fact. In 1571, the forces of the Crimean Khan Giray reached Moscow and burned the city to the ground. In other words, the hand of the Ottoman Sultan reached far and hit hard. And of course, Turks got into that juicy slave business. People captured in Slavic lands continued to be sold southward. The rulers of Moscow didn't like this arrangement, but there was nothing they could do yet. The key word being yet. Enter Russian Empress Catherine the Great, and you might wish to stand up in her imperial presence. In 1774, her troops finally cleared Crimea of Turkish control. Under the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca, try saying that 3 times fast, Russia gained the right to keep a fleet in the Black Sea and, just as importantly, secured duty-free passage for its merchant ships through the maritime straits. This alone gave Russian trade a massive boost. But Catherine was thinking much bigger. How much bigger can be seen from the names of her 2 eldest grandsons, Alexander and Constantine. Alexander, after Alexander the Great, the conqueror of Asia. Constantine, after Constantine the Great, Roman emperor, who moved the imperial capital to Constantinople. Get it? Catherine's foreign policy goal was nothing less than the capture of Istanbul, the creation of a vassal kingdom there with Constantine on the throne, and, most importantly, Russia's complete control over the straits. And, quite predictably, this policy failed. Predictably so, because this prospect was giving chills not just to the Turks, but also to the other European powers, above all Britain. Control of the straits would have given Russia a fundamentally new ability to project power. Just picture this. Tomorrow, a Russian naval squadron appears off the coast of Rome, or London. Such prospect would keep you up at night, which is why the entire 19th century in Russian foreign policy turned into a slow, exhausting tug of war. Russia tried, again and again, to secure passage through the straits. Europe, usually in alliance with Turkey, worked just as persistently to tie its hands. Here's the short timeline. 1809, London. The Anglo-Turkish Treaty closes the straits to all warships. Hooray for England. 1833, the Treaty of Hünkar İskelesi between Russia and Turkey briefly opens them to the Russian fleet. Russia has one-upped the Brits. 1841, the London Convention. Straits are closed again to everyone. Champagne is opened in London. 1856, after a catastrophic defeat by Britain, France, and Turkey in the Crimean War, Russia loses even the right to maintain a military fleet in the Black Sea. 1871, that right is restored. The straits, however, remain closed. And now it's time to state the obvious. Throughout this entire period, Russia was the aggressive side, and Europe was the defending one. You see, the benefits of opening the straits were wildly asymmetrical. If the straits opened, Russia gained the ability to threaten British possessions in Egypt, French possessions in Morocco, and Austrian interests in the Balkans. For Europe, this was an existential threat. That is precisely why, during yet another Russo-Turkish war in 1878, when the troops of General Mikhail Skobelev approached Constantinople itself, Britain drew a very clear line in the sand. A British squadron aimed its guns at Russian positions, and diplomats delivered an ultimatum. If Russian forces laid siege to the Turkish capital, Britain would enter the war. It was a risky move, but the risk was worth it. The price of opening the straits was simply too high. But what about in reverse? During the Crimean War, an Anglo-French squadron sailed through the straits and struck Crimea. For Russia, this amounted to little more than a mosquito bite. Yes, prestige took a hit, and national pride was bruised. But there were no truly vital strategic targets in Crimea, and the idea that a foreign landing force could disembark on the Black Sea coast and then marched from there toward Moscow belongs squarely in the realm of fiction. So the balance was obvious. Russia stood to gain enormously from open straits and lost almost nothing from closed ones. For Russia, the struggle over the straits was a struggle for expansion. For Europe, it was a struggle to defend itself from Russian expansion. And then, in the mid-19th century, this entire picture was flipped upside down, all because of one technological innovation. Here it is: railroads. From the moment Europe woke up to the whistle of the locomotive, the world was never the same.